everyone. Hope you've been able to find your keys in your playthroughs of the remastered editions, or getting all the updates. I've been really trying to figure out whether I should just buy that other edition of the Tomb Raider Remastered games, that the Epic Games one that was supposedly a lot better. But guess they changed it back. Maybe we'll get a nice patch later on. Again, I'm Chris, the Archaeologist. Here's some more artifact IDs from the second section in Greece, so for St. Francis Folly all the way to the Tomb of Tehoke. Again, if you've never heard or seen of my past video, this isn't really just to point out the accuracy so much as to point out things that real-life these inspirations come from, and also appreciate how the developers combine together these different elements. And I'm sure there are enough people who are somewhat negative about things that we like that I don't really think it's worth adding just more holier than thou commentary on accuracies and inaccuracies per se, so much as just sort of why this is cool and what the actual stuff looks like. Anyway, so let's take a look. Slight update on the last video though. I actually found the source of this image, ironically, while I was putting together some readings for a class I'm teaching. And turns out I got the right site. So it's from Shavin the Wantar, but there's a specific sculpture that matches it. And it's actually a feline figure with what are known as brugmansia, plants or flowers are emanating from its mouth. These are actually plants with a hallucinogenic effect. It's another plant that might have been used in rituals at that ancient temple. And here's a book if you're interested. We start off with the start of the level where you see the actual site of St. Francis Folly, which is not a real location, but it's a very, I thought it was a really cool design to it because it reminds me of those mountainside monasteries, but it really shows how and why you have all of this stuff at this site, right? It gives an excuse to it. The other one, the first level in Peru, was supposedly in these mountain caves. This time it's on a giant cliff, so that's why it hasn't been discovered in a sense. Though it's continued as a place of continued use, because it looks like it's gone from Greek to Rome. There's a Roman period to it, and then there's this much more later European design. And there's no real mountain monastery type site that necessarily has a whole complex of the Colosseum or amphitheater equivalent and whatnot. But it's cool to see it, and also not sure if also when I saw this photo I was just thinking about that new collector's bundle, which I don't know if I should get, but it seems, if you're interested, it does seem pretty accurate. Not that I'm shilling for everything Tomb Raider related, but I think it's really cool to actually get to see these things. Yeah, even if that bag seems to be pleather, though. To my knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome is a little rusty compared to my knowledge of Andean archaeology, Peruvian archaeology in particular. But I did start out with my bachelor's with interest in classics and Near Eastern studies. But I've only really worked on Roman and Byzantine sites at best. So worked in Italy one season and a couple of seasons in Jordan, where I excavated through some Byzantine levels. So to some extent I can talk about it, but definitely not gonna. If I make a mistake, I do apologize for any classicists. And so yeah, here's a terrible photo of me in the field I found a stylus. It's the OG type of stylus, which is a very ornately carved bone writing utensil for writing on wax tablets. And I found this in a Roman market area during an excavation, so McCallum. But anyways, let's move on to the actual thing. So this stuff is fairly well known, so I won't really go through it too much in terms of the design. So as soon as you go into the main section of St. Francis Folly, you see these very classic Greek fret designs, that sort of wave-like pattern on the top left here. The ceiling is actually not quite Greek per se, so much as it looks like the Pantheon. So the Pantheon is a large temple structure that is in Rome, and not to be confused with the Parthenon. And certainly it's a place to go, and you might have already read about it. There's also the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian type columns that you'll see in the entire level. You'll see multiple different types as well. To go into some of the more specific details. So one of the big patterns that you'll see in the level, and this is both in the original, the remaster, and the anniversary, is this inspiration from the domed coffered ceiling. So these little squares that are found designed into the structure itself. This is known as a coffered ceiling, and a dome design it really does draw primarily the inspiration here with that central hole at the top is really drawn from the Pantheon more than any other ancient structure, I would say, given that it's one of the most famous and longest surviving domed ceilings of this sort in the ancient world. And as you go into the first section, you'll find this bit of sculpture on the wall, and it's presented almost as these wall reliefs, but what actually is the base of a Koros, the sculpture of a young man. And this thing of all things and actually turns out to be a square base where the statue actually stood on. And so the example of this base comes from the National Museum of Athens, depicting a group of wrestlers. This one's actually quite tricky, and I did see someone else online, so there is another much earlier project but that hasn't been active since 2019, the Tomb Raider Art Encyclopedia. Amazing resource in the original ones, though doesn't cover all objects, which is what I'm trying to do. So they actually identified this as a griffin or a dragon, which is neither of which it is actually. I thought it was too, and I was looking through lots and lots of examples of griffins to try to find an exact example, and they really don't fit it. It's what's known as a cockatrice, which is not to be confused with a basilisk or a griffin or hippogriff or a dragon, all of which are found on crests, on these coat of arms, clan crests, as dual-facing sculptures like this switch. They're very similar creatures, just minor differences. If you note, for example, I'm just juxtaposing this old 1st millennium BC Luristan, a set of bronze griffins, compared to the switch. You see at first sight they look very similar, but if you look at the specific details, the way the wings are not quite feathered, as you can see, the heads, you can't really see it too well, but they're much more bird-like on the switch itself, with only 2 claws, 2 feet, as opposed to the griffins, which have 4 feet. And if you look at the tail is almost snake-like. And I'll talk more a bit about what the slight differences are, or at least show it on a slide. Might save some time with this. Yeah, so here are some differences between all these different types of animals and what makes it a cockatrice as opposed to everything that's very similar: basilisk, hippogriff, griffin. And I'm going to be putting some examples from Dungeon Meshi, the manga or anime, which is making the rounds on Netflix, and something fun to read about if you want to. I only realized that this was a cockatrice because of this manga. So yeah, sometimes weird connections can be made, but I guess your interests are similar. Well, I guess they can have intersections, which is wonderful. I really recommend watching or reading the manga, actually, if you're interested in mythological animals. And I've given these and some of the other things that I talked about in the last video. Maybe I will dedicate a whole series to mythological animals that are found in different cultures. That might be a fun way to go about it. Anyways, so moving on to the next one. So this one's a bit of a puzzle because it's in one of the pools of water that you jump into near the start of the St. Francis Folly section, and it isn't clear. There's a rumor online about maybe it being an accident, but it really seems a little too convenient for that, honestly. So it's only in the remastered edition, and this is a painting called Girl with an Earring from 1665 by Vermeer, the Dutch painter, and it's actually in a museum in the Netherlands. I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, so I'm just gonna list it here. And so I don't really know its relevance, other than it being an Easter egg maybe by the developers. It is a painting that's found in her mansion, but why it's here specifically for the remastered edition, not really clear. It is a bit of a shock though, like if you're jumping into the water and you get out and you suddenly see this face. But yeah, no real relevance to ancient Greece or Rome here in this context. But when you go into the Poseidon room, or the Neptune room, which is what it's called in the original game, the Roman equivalent of Poseidon. And in this room, once you go in, there are actually 2 very interesting features. There's one that is in this pool. You see this painting of dolphins, and then you see on the right, you see a bunch of people standing in line in a procession of sorts. And they're both real things, actually, but they're very different and not associated with Neptune or Poseidon. So the first one here, in terms of the actual relief itself, it's a marble votive relief dedicated to the Thracian goddess Bendis. So she's similar to Artemis, it seems, and it's from Piraeus, Athens, supposedly, and it's currently at the British Museum. But what the developers did was cut out the actual goddess herself, Bendis, and just put them in a row. And what you're seeing is actually supposedly Bendis in front of 2 officials who are clothed, and then behind them you see a bunch of athletes behind them, perhaps petitioning or facing the goddess herself. And maybe petitioning isn't really the word, I would say, necessarily. And this is a bit of if you would like to read about it, this is the description from the British Museum. So it's a bunch of relay racers in front of two officials who stand in turn in front of Bendis. As for the other one, that's actually from the Palace of Knossos, so the legendary palace from Crete that's sometimes associated with the legend of the Minotaur in the labyrinth underneath it. And it's actually, this is a fresco of dolphins in a bath hall section of the palace. There's some issues with the Palace of Knossos in the sense that there was a lot of, shall we say, reconstruction or conservation work that was done by Arthur Evans when he worked at the site. So, but anyways, won't go into that too much. But it is pretty cool. It's actually very true to the actual design, unlike some of the other images that we see in the games. This is very well recreated. In fact, it's made to be quite beautiful in the remastered edition. And then moving into the Sword of Damocles room, you see this cartoony sword, and I think it's likely meant to be a representation of the Greek Xiphos. So it's one of several different types of swords that would have been found in ancient Greece, depending on the time period. And here's a British Museum example that's about as close as you could get to that. I'm sorry if anybody here watching is a HEMA person, an ancient swords person, knows better and is completely wrong. Ironically, I study ancient conflict, but of the Andes. I know a crap ton of stuff about Andean mace heads, Mesoamerican weapons, East Asian weapons because I'm East Asian, but I'm not so good with Mediterranean and otherwise European swords. So if I'm wrong, please do correct me, as always. I love to know what it might actually look more like. And then of course you have the other major mix-up in the Greece section. There's a Thor room, so this was changed later in the Anniversary Edition to be a little bit more accurate. And in the Thor room, you actually have this very cool, very beautiful painting of Thor sitting on a throne with his helmet and holding a staff, but it's not really clear what the original painting was. So unfortunately, my attempts at searching it through books of paintings or online, even worse online, I had to put lots of pictures of the Hemsworth version of Thor. So if you do know, please let me know. This is a pretty cool painting, though, I gotta say. And you can see sort of that knotted design all around it. Very, very not Greek and not Roman. So this one, right on the pediment, so that triangular thing that's called a pediment, there is a face that is reminiscent of a bunch of different things. It could be a Medusa-looking face. It has somewhat feline qualities, so it could be a Medusa face. It could be. It's also reminiscent of this sculpture of a theater mask from Herculaneum. Sorry, I said that in such a nerdy way. Herculaneum. There are also some later faces like this one from 130 CE from Rome as well. So it doesn't look like more common faces you would see in these kinds of contexts, but I do get the feeling that it has some specific reference, but otherwise it refers to something akin to these. And then moving on to the next section, you have the Colosseum. The Tomb Raider one, the original one, and the remastered isn't really quite Colosseum-y because of the limitations of design, right? Everything, you can't really have anything circular in the original game because of the limitations of the developers and the game engine itself. Everything's square, so you actually end up with a squared out version of not quite exactly the Colosseum per se, but a Colosseum looking thing, an amphitheater looking thing. And so the Colosseum, unlike as we term it, is really a bit of a misnomer. It would have, if you're talking about what we call the Colosseum, is actually the Flavian Amphitheater, and it would have been called that rather than the Colosseum. And the Colosseum, as we call it today, referring to large event centers, wouldn't have necessarily been used in the same way. And definitely not ancient Greek, because if the Greeks, they had theaters, not so much these types of amphitheaters. They were much more Roman. And there's an example of a Greek theater, right? Much more semicircular, definitely for more theatrical performances of plays as opposed to gladiator battles of ancient Rome or the Munera battles that preceded it, and events that preceded it, sorry, which don't want to simplify it too much or be too reductive. Lots of classicists out there. I apologize in the way I'm simplifying things. But yes, so it's quite interesting because it has these event boxes. It almost is influenced by modern perspectives on performance or event centers. Right? You see in the back here right across from Lara is this large event box of sorts, and then you have a few benches in the background, and you have that procession, that votive relief that I showed you earlier, all around the sides, all around the edges of the athletes in front of Bendis. And the actual ground itself, it isn't really textured in a way to look like the Colosseum ground, but it does have these holes that lead to underground chambers with cells, so very much evoking the Flavian amphitheater. So for another example, aside from the Colosseum, which I've seen pictures of, at least if you have not had the chance to go, please do go. It's a very cool place to be. But here's a Pompeii example of a smaller amphitheater in that you might also find aside from the Colosseum itself. So looking at the booths themselves, so this is a view from inside one of the booths in the game, and it is located across from another large booth. These are a little exaggerated. They're much bigger. They're more akin to modern amphitheater boxes for private events than the actual spots for the seating for elites or even the emperor himself. And also in these booths you see a depiction of a reclining chair that is found in ancient Greece, and also this design does also exist and was adopted by the Romans for large feasting, eating events. Now in the cistern level, so we're actually moving quite fast because, interestingly, unlike the first level, the Peru level, there's a lot less iconographic imagery, sculptural imagery in the St. Francis to Tomb of Tehokan levels, as there are not just in comparison to Peru, but also the Egyptian section, which I'm also working on currently, and it is massive, especially if you're combining with the anniversary stuff. But in terms of just trying to find these lion-headed fountains, they're found quite common in many ways. They're generic in Europe in some ways, but they do have some, and the way that this one's designed, it doesn't look Greek to me, but there is something similar if you want to try to find a real life example in the past. So here's one from a ceramic vessel where you have a lykthos. I am not going. I apologize, but yeah, it's a Polyxene at the fountain. So she's being watched by Achilles, and so this is an early similar equivalent if you were to find one. If you were to try to find a version of it. These gargoyles, they look fictional to me. They don't really look like medieval gargoyles. They're a little bit rounder, a little bit more cartoony. So, and certainly there aren't really these types of statues in ancient Greece or Rome, at least of this style. They very much they vaguely look like medieval ones, but they're a little rounder than you would expect. They look more like something you'd find in a fantasy game or like a dungeon level that you'd fight. This wall design, there is an equivalent, but more so from a Roman child's sarcophagus. This is an example from Libya and is found in the British Museum. So this one I have no idea, but maybe a classicist or someone who knows Greek or ancient Greek could chime in. I only ever took Latin when I was in high school and also in university. That's never taken any Greek at all, unfortunately. I might do that someday. I should, just out of personal interest. So later on you're actually shot out of this giant mouth, and this, if you look at the features above the eyes, it actually looks a lot like a satyr, and this probably might have been based off of a satyr mask that's associated with Greek performances, Greek theater, but enlarged on a very monumental level, which there is no equivalent to as far as I'm aware of. It also reminds me of the Mouth of Truth, so it's an image of Oceanus that's mounted against the wall of a church currently, and it was associated with the Forum Boarium in Rome. So not quite really, but more so the satyr, but I thought of the other one as well. And then we get into the actual Tomb of Tehokan section. And on the pedestal where you get the next piece of the scion is a Pegasus, but not quite sure if it refers to any specific one, to be honest. That specific design isn't exactly how it would be. It looks a little bit more later European to me, at least the way it's designed. And then in the original and remastered edition, you have this faux Egyptian wall painting that really I don't think it quite references it, remixes elements of actual Egyptian iconography, things that we might talk about later. But yeah, this one actually might be the representative of maybe the arrival of Natla, Tehokan, and Qualopec, but they're portrayed as Cyrus, so the god of the underworld in Egypt. And I will talk more about that when we move on to that level. I'm working on it. Again, it's massive, and so it's taking me a bit of time. So I'm actually working on this and the other one concurrently. But for the sake of completion, I'm also covering the Anniversary Edition here too, and it has a little bit more. It's like, and received a few updates and probably some more accurate improvements from the original or the remastered ones. And of course, the Thor room is now the Physis room, and the Neptune room is the Poseidon room. So the second one is more of a minor change. And so you can see St. Francis Folly again. It is a still very well preserved, probably still in use, monastery or church building that Lara climbs up off the side of the cliff, though it's very well manicured. I'm going to be hyper obsessive as an archaeologist. It is very well manicured. So after you enter and as you climb through the pillars, above onto the pillars, and you jump around, you'll find two different things, right? One, you have that design of at the bottom on the ground, and then later in an area where you shoot certain stars, you see Perseus holding the head of Medusa on the ground, and you see what is actually a section of the Parthenon marbles. So again, not to be confused with the Pantheon, which is in Rome. The Parthenon is the temple dedicated to Athena in Athens. And this actually comes from the British Museum collection of the, what are sometimes also called the Elgin marbles, which was taken a while ago by Lord Elgin when Greece was still under Ottoman rule, and then later on. Since then, Greece, after it regained its independence, has been asking for them back from the British Museum. And so here's another example of the same that is a much later section. I think this is actually from the Palace of Midas, or the Midas section. So here, okay, so just to break it down a little bit more. So the top one is actually of cavalry from the Parthenon frieze, the exact sections if you'd like to look it up and read more about it. And the bottom similarly. Here's another example in the section where you are rolling that astronomical sphere down to activate this switch. In the initial section of St. Francis Folly, you also see this east frieze here. Also, again, currently displayed at the British Museum. And yes, in case I gave any astronomers or astronomy nerds a heart attack earlier, yes, they are called armillary spheres. And interestingly enough, the game has you pull this rod that's supposedly connecting it to the pedestal here, but I don't think it really clearly shows that it connects to that pedestal in order to dislodge it. And also, conveniently, they removed the actual sphere in the center. So usually there's either a sphere that's a model of the Earth or a model of the Sun. So for anybody who might nitpick, the game conveniently just removes it entirely, even though it's the basis of the entire model itself. But yeah, I don't know if this is based off of any specific armillary sphere though, and you generally would not find it on a pedestal this small like that. And again, the Medusa face, but with wings behind it as grapple locations. The image of Perseus holding the head of Medusa is actually a little bit more specific than just being an image of it from a Greek example or a Roman example of the story. It actually comes from a much later illustration, a star chart, by the founder of lunar topography, supposedly. He's Hevelius Johannes, and from his Firmamentum sub Scantium Sive Uranographia. So I apologize again for my pronunciation. That is not my specialty. But it's actually of a constellation instead. So links back to it, but it's very cool, very overly specific reference, to be honest. I'm actually quite impressed all the time by the developers, the folks that did research, did the art for these levels, really did an amazing deep search into trying to find some really cool imagery. I don't know which books they reference, but this reference to Hevelius and his image of Perseus holding the head of Medusa is not something that you would find in a lot of books, especially if you were just gonna go and design a level that takes place in Greece. You wouldn't really find this. This is pretty cool though. Again, art major maybe looking through this. And some images of the fixed rooms. And then the Poseidon room, formerly the Neptune room, has been completely revamped, right? We don't have the same frescoes of the dolphins, and you don't have the votive relief to Bendis. You actually have an actual reference to Poseidon himself. And this is actually a mosaic. It's called The Triumph of Neptunus at Sousse. It's at the Archaeological Museum in Tunisia, and that museum is, I believe, the second largest collection of mosaics in the world. So that's pretty cool to hear. But yeah, so this is actually based off of a real mosaic piece, and it's repeated several times in this level. So there's this fish with its tail above its head, and actually these types of sculptures are found in multiple places in Rome, but I think the closest one, interestingly enough, is from a fountain that's right in front of the Pantheon. So I mentioned that as being that domed building with a coffered ceiling. That is actually in front of that temple. But it's actually only a component of it, as you can see. And actually, if you look at the bottom here, if you look at that face, just as I mentioned before, that might actually be one of the influences for that giant satyr-looking face. I don't think this is a though. That said, so interesting. It might be somebody looked at the Pantheon, just took a bunch of influences from it. Well, these fish mosaics, I couldn't really find an exact example, but there are plenty of mosaics of fish. They're from Rome, if you're interested. Now, in the Atlas room, you see this statue of Atlas holding up the heavens, and this is, again, completely revamped from the original and the remastered editions, of course. But it doesn't, and you have kind of these reliefs of Atlas in the background on the walls as well, but the actual statue itself isn't quite ancient Greek or ancient Roman. It really is very much more Art Deco looking. And so I think some real life examples the real life closest example I could find would be the Atlas statue at the Rockefeller Center in New York City that dates to around 1937. And here's a more well-known, on the right hand side, ancient example of the Farnese Atlas from the 2nd century CE, and this is at the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, and is more, might be what those reliefs in the background against the wall might be referring to. A much more classical, a real life classical image that you would find. So yeah, it really looks like something, the statue really looks like something out of BioShock instead. And in fact, actually, the anniversary edition came out the same year, 2007, as the original BioShock. But it's a bit reaching to say that, but it's a fun coincidence that it had two games that featured this imagery, but it's much more minor for Tomb Raider, of course. So again, this one, you also at the bottom of the Atlas statue are a bunch of spears, so this is cross comparison with an actual bronze spearhead from Olympia, Greece, from 900 to 780 BCE from the British Museum. And then in this section, there's also another secret, this sword. It strikes me as a Bronze Age sword, but the exact version comparison or whatever it might be based off isn't really clear to me. Again, any sword nerds who are watching this, maybe a bit more. And I'd love to, again, hear. But I think this one, really, I'd love to hear anybody who has more knowledge of this stuff. I'm interested in learning more about it again myself. In the Hephaestus room, you have these reliefs of Hephaestus now, with a big billowing cape and swinging his hammer against an anvil, it seems, but I couldn't really find any comparative example to that, really. You also have this mosaic on the ground of almost exact image as well, of Hephaestus at work, but really there's no close example. The closest image I could find is this Forge of Vulcan, so it's the Roman equivalent of Hephaestus in House 7 at Pompeii. So this dates to 50 to 79 CE in Italy, of course. Another cool place to visit, by the way, Pompeii. I've managed to go twice, and it is awesome every time. It's so rare to get to walk around an actual, pretty well preserved and maintained Roman settlement, really. And in the same room, you see these statues of a hoplite. It looks more like a later modern bust of one, though. If you just search online, you search up like bust of a hoplite, you find much closer examples to what you see in the game. But here's a real life example of one that is the closest that I could find. It's a statue of a hoplite named Leonidas from 480 to 470 BCE, and it's from Sparta and the Acropolis sanctuary of Athena. And yeah, it is now currently in the Archaeological Museum of Sparta. So it's not actually a statue of Leonidas, by the way. It's just there was a workman that decided to call it that, and as is so often the case in archaeology, nicknames do stick when we don't know exactly what they are. So the next, in the Sword of Damocles room, you also see this depiction of this very muscular guy with his hand on his hip posing. It could refer to multiple things. Certainly it's not very diagnostic. It has, in the game itself, you have this sword above that figure to represent Damocles, more or less, in the game. But in terms of real life example, it doesn't look, it's not reminiscent of an actual image of Damocles as far as I'm aware of. There are two examples I found that are similar. There's the Farnese Hercules. It's by Glycon from 216 AD or CE, and it's from the Baths of Caracalla in the National Museum, and it's now currently in the National Museum of Archaeology in Naples, and it's based off of an actual earlier Greek original version by Lysippus in the 4th century BC. And yeah, this one's actually pretty famous. That statue is found in a lot of imagery of Hercules in pop culture as well. It's also possible it refers to other types of reliefs. So here's another example of a relief of Asclepius at the Louvre. So not quite the most diagnostic image, but certainly very creative of them to try to combine the two to create an image of Damocles. Here's the updated version of the swords that we saw in the previous example. This one again looks like a Bronze Age sword to me, a bunch of Bronze Age swords to me. But again, I could be wrong. So this one is actually very low resolution, but it is of a diagnostic type. It's of ancient Greek banquet scene and often found on things like funerary stela. This is an example from Thassos, Greece, and is in the Museum of Archaeology in Turkey. So here's another example of one of these banquet scenes. So this one, Medusa headed gate. I couldn't really find any examples, and it certainly is not something you would find in ancient Greece or Rome. It is much more later European, and the closest one I could find is this one of the Medusa head gates from the royal palace of Turin. So this was much more later, 16th to 17th century Italy. And now we're back at the Colosseum again, or the amphitheater section, and again they really did recreate it, and the one from the original and later now, of course, the remastered. And again, they keep these massive booths that aren't quite accurate per se, but they're cool. They made them even better now. And you do have these statues of Athena on the side as well, instead of having that procession of athletes in front of Bendis. The level does resemble later European illustrations or reconstructions of Roman Amachia, so naval battles that were staged in Roman amphitheaters. Here are two examples, and you can see the way the outside of the building, as well as I think some of the statues around it, kind of resemble what you see in the level. And you have these multiple statues of Athena. Couldn't identify all of them, like the one on the left, for example, where she's in thought. I couldn't really find a good comparative example, but the statue that is in the actual arena itself does look like the statue of Athena Minerva from the Vatican. And I mean, there are a lot of statues of Athena with the spear and with her shield or aegis, sometimes with Medusa's head mounted onto it, or Gorgon's face mounted on it, which again links it back to that image of Perseus with holding Medusa's head that we saw at the start of levels. So there's a bit of interesting continuity and intent behind the design. That's pretty cool. So just for comparison, another example of the Colosseum, of which this is partly based off of, and the section where the emperor would be, as opposed to these much more massive, luxurious booths that are created in the game. And on top, in the game, you actually see that they've transplanted the coffered ceiling of the Pantheon, jeez. I mix it up. Don't worry if you mix it up. Supposedly a PhD candidate. Anyways, real amphitheaters in ancient Rome, and it was particularly the Roman Colosseum, did not have anything like that, right? It would be very logistically difficult to create a dome ceiling on top of an amphitheater like that. But they did have what are known as a vellarium. So here's an example of both a fresco from Pompeii, as well as an actual ancient Roman fresco, and also a much later European painting of these large vellariums, cloth coverings for the tops of the amphitheater at times to provide some shade. Okay, and then we get to Midas's palace. The statue of Midas in the center actually doesn't refer to any image of Midas. There really aren't too many images of Midas, and it also isn't quite ancient Greek, the statue, because if you look, very clean shaven face. If you look at the laurel wreath on the head, the bowl cut look, that is actually very Roman. And so for comparison, here is on the left-hand side a statue of Neptune based on the statue of Zeus at Olympia. So this isn't the actual statue of Zeus at Olympia, but this is based off of that statue from around 435 BCE in Greece. And the original version was one of the lost seventh wonder of the world. And you can see a much more Greek-looking figure with long hair, long beard, though he's garbed in a similar manner to the statue that we see. Much more similar to the one we see in the game are these statues of Augustus and Trajan, both from the Pergamon Museum. Right, you can see the laurel wreaths on the forehead, the much more bowl-cut look look to the emperors, which I suppose was much more stylish back in the day, though I guess it is making a resurgence here with a lot of Asian pop stars. But even more, if you looked at the way that they're posed, it's much more active, whereas in the game, you see that the figure is sitting very statically with the hands supposedly against two armrests or pillars, or not pillars, but armrests. And really that doesn't look like anything from ancient Greece or Rome per se, though it could look like something from a few other cultures. I might be wrong, but it really looks more like the Lincoln Memorial more than anything. Though the Lincoln Memorial itself, of course, is modeled off of classical Mediterranean influences. And then here, going back to the cistern area, you have instead some human-faced fountains, and especially this set of triple-faced bearded figures. Some real examples come from ancient Rome. On the bottom left here, you have an image of Neptune as a fountain, Mount Neptune's bearded face as a fountain in Herculaneum, as well as another example on the right-hand side. And also I just give a reference to a journal article if you're interested in reading up on those. But as far as I can tell, nothing exists in ancient Rome or Greece that has this very really awesome, cool, triple-faced set of, well, not triple-faced, but set of triple fountains going into this pool here in the game. And then in this other section of Midas' palace, you see this elaborate fence around the column that is much more later European again. So whoever was maintaining St. Francis Folly. St. Francis Folly is clearly very well maintained. I just don't know where everyone else is. Maybe they're hiding because of Pierre popping up every so often and shooting at Lara, or Lara running around shooting, or whatever animal outbreak that they have. Lion-headed fountains reappear also as these fire-breathing towers in the new section that's specific to the anniversary edition. And then also specific to the anniversary edition, you also have some of these relics, which I think I should have covered the Peru ones last time. We'll cover in a separate video or short of this griffin head here. And it's actually a cauldron fitting of all things, and it's around from 700 to 600 BC from Rhodes, and it's also something from the British Museum. So whoever was designing this level, or at least putting the art and artifacts in this level, it really was looking at the British Museum for most of the inspiration, I believe. This painting in the room with the bunch of spears, I don't really know what it is, because what makes it different. So at the outset, it looks like a wall painting. It could be which it could be. It also reminds me of black figure pottery or red figure pottery, but it's not quite fitting that. The problem with the way and it may be just that the artist modified it a bit, but the challenge here is that the figures are in black and the horses are in a lighter color, but they're not. If you look at actual red figure pottery, black figure pottery, that would not be how people would be portrayed as compared to horses. So I don't really know what this is, but if anyone figures this one out, this would be really cool. And it seems to be a person on a horse fighting someone who, if you look carefully, it makes more sense. Someone on a horse fighting somebody who's standing on the ground. So cavalry versus foot soldier, it seems. And then here in the same room, we have the second artifact, or relic. And this is actually based off of an owl-shaped Proto-Corinthian bios. So it's actually a vessel in the form of an owl. And the opening in the tail and the hole in the base to suspend a lace. By a lace. So yeah, so it's actually from the Stadtlich in Germany. And then the Tomb of Tihokin is also completely revamped this time around with a bunch of wall paintings in the background. So there's a repeating pattern of one painting on the left-hand side here, and then a set of different paintings behind Lara in the background as well. And I got lucky this time because it's very specific in many ways. So this is actually, the one on the left is of a Greek tomb painting from southern Italy, and it's actually in the US right now. It's in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And then behind Lara, and so where you can see Pierre is coming from, he sneaks up on Lara, is this Etruscan tomb fresco. It's the liberation of Caelois Vibena, an Etruscan folk hero from the late 4th century BC. And it's from the so-called Francois tomb in Volci, Lazio. And apologies for my Italian pronunciation. I'm a Spanish speaker than I am an Italian speaker. I only speak Italian. Though I should. But really, it's so hard. They say you should learn couple of Romance languages. You pick up the third for free. It is you can in a sense, but it really screws with your pronunciation when you know more than one language, to be honest. But anyways, here is the actual tomb of the Francois tomb that it comes from, and there's this illustration that I found from a guy called or a person called Garland. And so just for fun, I decided to add these as well. If you look at the entrance into the tomb of Teotihuacan, you see these two braziers, or large stands with fire on them. A bit of a trope in pop culture in depicting ancient societies. If you watch The Mummy, they're braziers in front of temples. There's the same with Tomb Raider here, and a bunch of other generic depictions of an ancient society. But just here are some examples of similar actual objects from ancient Greece that are quite important, have a lot more research done. So there you have the escara on the right hand side, which are these small braziers which could range from cooking to being parts of fire altars or fire covers, as well as on the left hand side you have these what are known as sacrificial tripods, which are also sometimes present at temples to either hold something to burn as sacrificial offering or food, and is actually subject to some mythological conflicts. So on the bottom left you have Heracles and Apollo struggling over a sacrificial tripod, and in the center one, the large wine vessel here shows the vigor of Orestes before the sacrificial tripod at Delphi. So the Delphi being the place of one of the most famous oracles in all of ancient history, all of history really. So I won't go into that too much, but certainly if you're interested in these kinds of things, you might want to look up these two things beyond just looking at these. And also, one really cool thing I wanted to share as well is this invention by Heron of Alexandria. So oftentimes we see doors automatically opening, including this, either because of you pull a switch and it opens, or because someone lights a fire in movies and TV shows about archaeology or ancient history. And by and large, no, that doesn't really exist. But Heron of Alexandria did design this fire activated way of opening temple doors, which is pretty cool. So you would light the fire at the altar in front of the temple, and it would cause changes in the pressure through a pipe below, which would then help turn the doors and open them up. So generally non-existent in ancient history, but these types of inventions were designed, particularly by, if you're interested, Heron, I think there are some documentaries on Heron of Alexandria. Definitely something to look at. A real man ahead of his time, just like Leonardo da Vinci. And that's about it for the St. Francis Folly up until the Tomb of Teotihuacan section. So I do have a few smaller videos in the works as I work on trying to identify elements of the larger Egypt level that follows, since I'm doing the remastered and the anniversary editions. It is massive. So much of those things, the artifacts, the features, they're keeping me busy while I actually do other things, my actual work, teaching and doing research. So, but it's been really fun, and please keep an eye out for that. I might do a couple smaller videos specifically on maybe the starting part of the Lost Ark. If you're interested in Indiana Jones, South America section has a few cool things, though I haven't identified everything for that either. Still working on them with 10. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you liked it. Really hope this is interesting for those of you who like archaeology and like these franchises, or just like playing these games. And yeah, please like, subscribe, hit the notification button for more if you have not. I really don't know why it's gotten so much more complicated these days, but yeah. Anyways, I think the quality of these videos will probably improve over time, but for now, please do enjoy my very 2000s early YouTube type ramblings. Take care, and I'll see you next time.